Hello, everyone. This is Zachary Johnston. I'm hosting this panel, and I am the drinks editor for UPROXX. And I'm very excited to be here today because we're going to talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is grains in the process of making whiskey. So these weekly panels are designed to sort of be an educational forum for people looking to get more into whiskey. We're going to talk about spirits trends, tasting, investing, business history, and more. Again, today, we're specifically talking about grains. So might be a little more on the whiskey nerd side, but it's something that's massively important to the process of making all whiskey. Just before we jump in and introduce the guests, I just want to say that we really want to encourage participation. So if you've tuned in, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. And we'd really love for you to be involved. So there's a chat on the right side of your screen. There'll be a poll for questions to pop up. Feel free to join, comment, ask questions. We're going to try and answer questions via Q&A during the process of the hour. And you can upvote questions, so questions right at the top, and we might be able to answer them a little bit more quickly. So for me, grains is something I love to get into because I really, really enjoy talking about the specificity of what actually starts from the beginning and creating the flavor process. And for me, whether it's malted barley, yellow or white corn, or even blue corn, red corn, heirloom corn and bourbon, rye, wheat, brown rice, which we saw this year with Basil Hayden's toast. It all starts there for me. And so I'm very excited to have two amazing experts joining us today. And I'd first like to introduce us all to Dr. Stephen Jones, who's a PhD in molecular cytogenetics from UC Davis. He's a professor who works right now at Washington State University, go Cougars, and he works with the King Arthur Flower Endowed Chair, Organic Grade Breeding and Innovation, and now Stephen's working and directs the Wazoo BreadLab in Skagit Valley, Washington, where they're working with farmers all around the world, millers and bakers, to develop decentralized, equitable, affordable, non-commodity grain systems. So if you ever had a question about the minutia of what grains impart into whiskey, this is the person to ask. So Dr. Jones, welcome.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here.
Yeah, and I noticed this is an all Washington panel today. I'm from the Olympic Peninsula. I was born in Shelton and grew up in Port Townsend, and you're out there in eastern Washington. So.
No, I'm here. I'm actually in Mount Vernon. So.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, we're on the west side. So yeah.
Oh, very nice. So very briefly before we bring on our next guest, what was sort of your introduction to the road to study something as specific as grains and wheat? That sort of.
Well, I did my undergrad at Chico State in Northern California, and they had a program to teach city kids how to be farmers. And I grew wheat, and I grew 5 acres of wheat, and I fell in love with it. I looked at it every day from November 10th till June 20th of the next year, and I was haunted by it, and that got me into wheat, and I became a wheat and barley breeder, and that's what I'm still doing today. So that was 1977. I grew my first crop. I just fell in love with it.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I sort of really started diving deep into writing about whiskey and talking about whiskey was just looking for unique grains in mash bills and trying to find who's actually out there doing something different than the standard. And that really drove me more deeply into the product as a whole. So before we dive into that too much further, I'd like to bring on our second guest, who's one of, I think, the most iconic people in craft distilling today. He's the co-founder and master distiller of WESTLAND Distillery out in Washington, in Seattle. He studied economics at the University of Washington, so we're staying right in Washington's wheelhouse today. And he's also lived in Scotland, and he's back in 2015. Back in 2015, Westland was named Distillery of the Year by the American Distilling Institute, and I think has maintained an integral part in craft distilling since then. I'd like to welcome Mr. Matt Hoffman.
Great, thank you. Glad to be here. Same as Dr. Jones.
Yeah,
Look at this all-star panel of Washington State natives here, huh?
indeed.
Well, I guess you're not native, Steve Jones, but
No,
we accept you just as is. So.
Absolutely.
I'm a naturalized citizen.
That's right, naturalized citizen of Washington State.
Yeah. Well, if you've lived in the rain for 10 years or more, I think you get to say
Oh,
you're
yes.
a local. So, Matt, very quickly before we dive into the discussion, can you just give us a quick background of how you got into distilling? We know you lived in Scotland for a while, but what was your path there?
Well, my path into distilling was really interest in flavor. I mean, I grew up and I was very interested in flavor, and I grew up on kind of the industrial, food system, I guess I would say. As probably most people my age, didn't have a real connection to either the old country, where their ancestors came from and food traditions, but also to agriculture. And I think that's a product of the kind of modern day. We're not really connected to agriculture, and when I was tasting things that were fundamentally very simple, and on the surface level, whiskey counts, and we got to that eventually, but very simple things and the differences between those things, like a loaf of bread, and I really like that the amazing thing about just a few raw ingredients and how that could be so different and so complex, just really, I don't know what it was, but it hooked me. And when I learned about making whiskey, and you have 4 raw ingredients, one of them is water, and it's the most complex beverage on the planet, and you just go, that's an incredible way to explore flavor, and the restrictions of that are quite beautiful. So learned about that, went through the post-grad program in brewing distilling science out of Heriot-Watt in Scotland, and I'm just absolutely in love with making whiskey.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this topic. And just for the audience out there, again, thank you for joining. If you have questions, throw them in the chat. And to be clear for the audience, we're going to try and focus in as much as we can on the grains today. So there'll be other panel discussions about terroir and the soil, and other discussions about malting. And I'm sure those subjects will come up because we're talking about grains. But we're going to try to stay as laser focused as humanly possible. To that end, I wanted to sort of talk about a broad sort of umbrella term, because when we say grains, we're not talking about a single thing. And just to clarify that, I live in Berlin at the moment, and here they use the term corn, K-O-R-N, to describe grains in general. So, like, for instance, when the Dutch and Germans were out colonizing, they would qualify corn as the main grain product produced by that nation. So in Indonesia, corn was rice. In the Americas, corn was maize, or what we call corn now, and so forth. When we say grain in distilling, what are we talking about specifically? And maybe Matt, maybe you can field that one because it's a whiskey focused question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think most people, when they think about grain, they're thinking of the big 4. That's going to be barley, corn, wheat, and rye. I mean, most people, we think of where whiskey kind of came from was really, for the most part, barley in the British Isles and Scotland and Ireland. An evolution took place when immigrants from Scotland and Ireland came to North America and found that barley didn't grow particularly well in the Northeast, and that's where rye took off. Those same farmers eventually started moving to what is now modern day Kentucky, started using corn to make whiskey. And wheat's kind of always played a kind of supporting role. I guess I'd say wheat whiskey is not a huge category, but it's definitely played a supporting role, especially in grain whiskeys and blends, as well as in bourbons. So we really look at these, but as you said in the introduction, there's other grains that are out there too now that are being used by some of the more innovative producers. But we really look at it as barley, corn, wheat, and rye for the most part.
And Dr. Jones, just to sort of maybe clarify for people, like, you can see, like, visually, you can see a corn and you can see wheat and you can see the difference. Like it looks physically different. But what's sort of the nuanced difference between, say, a rye, a wheat, and a barley? Like, what are we looking at the difference between those 3?
Right. And first, I'll just kind of, you said we wanted to get nerdy, so I'll just say that technically a grain is produced by a grass that makes an edible dry seed. So like buckwheat is not a grain because it's not a grass, right? Buckwheat is like rhubarb. So it's a grass that produces an edible dry grain. And the seed itself, what we call the seed or the kernel, is actually a fruit botanically. So there's one for you. So wheat and barley and rye, those are fruits. Corn is a large seeded grain. The other ones are all small seeded grains. So a lot of times we'll say we work with small seeded grains. What we mean by that is rye, barley, and wheat. And the difference in the three main ones, they're a lot, but genetically they're pretty closely related, but they're different enough that it's difficult to make a cross and make a hybrid from them, right? So you can cross wheat and barley, you're not going to get anything out of it, right? You can cross wheat and rye and you will. You can produce a triticale. So the main sort of visual when you look at the seed, most barleys have a hull on them, right? So they have this sort of straw-like structure that sticks to the seed itself. So rye and wheat does not have that. Wheat is free threshing. That's why the maltsters kind of went to barley. It makes fermentable sugars more efficiently than wheat and rye, but also it has that built-in filter, right? So the brewers like it because it's not going to get all sticky. Speaking of sticky, rye gets really sticky. So if you brew or distill it, and we have a rye person in the lab right now that's just cracking up because we always say bad things about rye. But rye has really complex starches and they get gummy. And that's how you make true rye bread, but also in the distilling, it's a tough one because the starches get super gummy. Wheat is the most complex genetically. It's made up of 3 individuals. So barley and rye are what's called a diploid. So there's just one set of chromosomes. Wheat has 3. So it's super complex genetically, and it's more adaptable than the others for most regions. And most wheats are free threshing too. And wheat has a lot of gluten, and that's what makes it different from the others. And you don't want the gluten is protein, and you don't want a lot of protein in most distilling or brewing. It just gets in the way. So that's sort of a general look at it. They're all similar in age. We've been growing them in an organized way for about 10,000 years on the planet. Rye came a little later because it was a weedy grass that got into it. Again, we kind of disparaging rye a bit, but it got into the barley and wheat as a weed, and then people liked it. And these were really diverse mixed populations. So that's the small grains in a nutshell. And they're basically the first crops that were cultivated on the planet. It's about 10,000 years ago.
Right on. And so when we look at these grains through the lens of whiskey, in the sort of continental Europe, we had a little bit of rye whiskey going on back in the day, and you see that coming over to the Americas through the Dutch and the Germans. And then, of course, the barley whiskey is coming over through the Scotch, Irish, English, so forth. Matt, for you, when you look at your process of selecting grains, what are you specifically looking for in those grains? Is there an abundance? Is there a sugar content? Is there a protein content? Like, what's your process there?
Well, it all comes back to that primary thing that motivated me to get into this business to begin with, which is flavor. The exciting thing about barley and its history and its flavor profile within single malt whiskey is really exciting. Rye is really exciting too, as a grain actually. But barley has this beautiful history, and for me, it starts with the fact that barley grows really well in this place, in the Pacific Northwest, and this place we call home. It's like this is one of the best barley growing climates in the world. So what an exciting thing to be able to show people, in one of the places where barley can grow really well and really thrive, a whiskey that is made that is kind of evocative of place. So beyond that, of like that was kind of the genesis for Westland of like looking at barley coming from Washington State. About 90% of what we source now comes from Washington State. We use about an acre of barley every day for a frame of reference there. For anybody who's kind of wondering how much we use, but beyond that, it's flavor, and this is where the real challenge comes in. This is kind of gets the crux of why we're having this discussion, why we work with the BreadLab and Dr. Jones, is the way that the industry operates. The entire whiskey industry operates, with very, very few exceptions. I'm talking about, fractions of tenths of a percent in terms of total numbers of whiskey, everybody in the whiskey industry is sourcing grain as a commodity, like one would source steel or crude oil, and that's
Right? Or
and
your
you can
bottles.
yeah, and you can make good whiskey out of that. I'm not disparaging that. You can make good whiskey that way. But when we compare that to other industries, to wine or to high-end cuisine, we see that there's a disconnect in the way that those industries, these I think of them as philosophically adjacent industries, the way that they are looking at raw ingredients as a source of flavor, and the whiskey industry was not. And that was a big thing that
Right.
puzzled me at first. But as we got into it, we learned that, well, part of the problem is we need to reimagine that kind of from the ground up, from the agricultural point of view and from the grain breeding point of view. And so now we're at this point where what we're searching for in grain is flavor, but it's gone way beyond that now into reimagining what barley almost could be. And I guess we'll get into that as we go on here.
So let's talk a little bit about the structure of let's stick with barley for the sake of the conversation to keep it simple. Let's talk about the structure of the barley seed, or the fruit to be specific. What is happening inside of that morsel that transmits flavor into the whiskey? Is it just purely from the sugars? Is it, what's going on there?
What's amazing about that question is that question is not commonly asked. And I appreciate that you're asking that question. It's kind of the whole point of this discussion. But there's very little research into the mechanisms of barley flavor. When people look at it, as I said, because people treat grain as a commodity, people are looking at it as like, it doesn't matter what the flavor mechanisms are typically. They're saying the flavor mechanisms don't matter because we don't want flavor deviations. However, when we look at it, there's a few things. The first is oil. So in grains, this is kind of from my point of view personally. We look at oil. So barley has a lipid content, an oil content of about 2.5%. And Dr. Jones, I'm sure, could correct me if I'm off here. But within that, there are flavorful oils. And say like corn, for example, will have an oil content of like 4%. We'll have different sorts of oils, fatty acids, fatty acid esters that are in there that provide flavor. The second big thing that we get from malted barley in particular, this is why this is really important, the malted part, is when you malt a grain, what you're doing is you're sprouting the grain, you are allowing the grain to produce the natural enzymes in the grain, which will convert later on in the mashing process starch into sugar. That is the whole point of the malting process. However, in order to get at that starch, we need to break down the internal structure of the grain, which is what we call a protein matrix. It basically proteins which kind of hold the whole grain together, which is why a raw barley grain is quite tough. It's hard to bite into because it's got this protein structure. A malted grain will produce the enzymes inside of the grain to break down these proteins. Now, when you break down proteins, you get compounds called amino acids. And amino acids, in combinations with sugars, under a process called the Maillard reaction, produce flavor. Now, anytime you cook or bake anything, I guarantee if you've cooked today, you've almost certainly used the Maillard reaction at home, right? This is why toast doesn't taste like hot bread. Toast tastes like toast, right? It has a distinct flavor, and bread doesn't taste like dough, or hot dough. You know what I mean? So there's these combinations under heat of sugars and amino acids coming together. So because the grain is malted, because the grain has undergone this transformation inside of the grain, breaking down the proteins into 20 different amino acids, you have this huge setup of flavor precursors which come together under the malting process. So when we look at flavor, we're looking at primarily those Maillard reaction products, and those form a lot of the roasted malts, which are in our whiskeys you can taste today. But then there's lipid contents and varietal differences. But the honest truth is that this isn't studied enough, and this is part of the reason why we're doing this. This work with Dr. Jones in the BreadLab is because people aren't investigating flavor in barley and the origins where it comes from. We've got these little nuggets that we know, but how much we can drill down into it, I think we're going to discover a lot over the next 10 years.
So has anyone looked at the breakdown of, let's say you grab a barley, I'm just going to use grain as a catch-all here, but you grab a barley grain from Scotland, you grab a barley grain from Ireland, you grab one from Washington, you grab one from maybe upstate New York and you break down and you look at what's going on inside them, or is that research that's still sort of forthcoming?
I would say that research is still sort of forthcoming. I think there has been some work done on proving that there are differences, and this is where you get into terroir, like when we use the idea of the environmental terroir differences. And I know that we're going to try to stay on track here and not terroir not so much, but like you can track those and prove that in whiskey, and several distilleries have done studies on that. So that all exists. But as far as like what is causing those and the full process, because that grain goes through so many steps, from malting to mashing to distilling, to fermentation to distilling, and on it goes. And which things carry through there is not commonly understood. It's just understood at this point. So we're still, I think, as an industry, and this is really only a very small percentage of the industry as a whole, are the ones who are trying to unravel that thread and kind of discover, well, why is that flavor different? We know that it is, but why is it still, and how do those things carry through from the raw ingredients?
So if we look at a grain like, for instance, in a single pot still in Irish whiskey, where it's malted barley and unmalted barley, and we don't need to get into the history of that right now. We can have an Irish panel discussion about that. But would it be accurate to say that the unmalted barley, since it's still sort of a raw grain, would be bringing more of those oils you mentioned into the mash, and whereas the unmalted barley would be more of the starch?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on Irish whiskey, but fundamentally the unmalted barley will not have gone, because it's not gone through that malting process where it has broken down the protein structures. There are less free amino acids that are in the mash as those things are mixed together that would be able to create additional flavors, because you can get Maillard reactions not just in malting, but also in the still as well. So this is where direct fire stills were so important for a long time, is because that application of heat would work there as well. So they're getting some starch there. So I would say, maybe if I could answer your question a different way, like the flavor from the unmalted grain, I am hypothesizing here, would be more lipid or oil content derived rather than from the malted grain, whereas you'd have a lot more of these free amino acids. And it's not just the Maillard reaction, the amino acids plus the sugars, but it's also the yeast in fermentation, because the yeast strain, as it ferments, is using, depending upon the strain of yeast, is using the different amino acids in different ways for its molecular processes to function, to keep going. Sometimes it takes one of those amino acids and doesn't produce a flavor off of it. Sometimes it takes it and produces a flavor compound, usually higher alcohols is what we call those. So there's all of that gets unlocked during fermentation as well. So that's one of the things that malted barley, you don't just have the flavor in the grain, but you'll have more flavor for the yeast to unlock in fermentation as well.
Gotcha. And I have a sort of, I know we're not really talking about terroir here, but we're going to talk a little bit about regionality, in that you both mentioned that, Washington State is a good place to grow barley. And we sort of know through the propagation of corn around the world, corn can kind of grow anywhere. So maybe, Dr. Jones, you could sort of walk us through what's going on with corn that it can kind of grow anywhere. Is it just a matter of there's so many strains? And what's going on with barley, where it has this sort of Goldilocks zone of these, cold, rainy, but, temperate places that helps it grow so well?
Yeah, and I don't really do corn, but
Oh, that's fair. It's okay. Yeah.
I don't even like them much. But any of those are jobs for breeders, right? Of expanding the territory, right? And with corn, yeah, there are certain latitudes that handle it better. I would argue that wheat and barley will grow in more places than corn would, right? Certainly across the planet. So you can grow it basically anywhere, right? So I kind of argue that. And what you did hit on something that we feel is very important is these small grains are cool season grasses. So that's, and being from Shelton, that it's cool here in July, right? In June and May and wet, and today is foggy and cold. It could just easily be June here. So the small grains love that. Corn is a warm season grass. So if that makes sense. So if you think of where corn really thrives, Central America, Mexico, the Midwest, the upper Midwest, these very hot, dry environments is where it thrives. One knock on corn is it takes a lot of water, right? So, and barley, one beauty of barley is it's probably the grain that requires the fewest inputs of anything. It doesn't require much nitrogen, which is great for the environment, right? Because we want the protein low. It smothers weeds because we've all seen barley grow and it's just this rank kind of thing that can fall over and it's very leafy and heavy and that can smother out weeds. So not speaking for Matt, but the both of us are really interested in organic production, regenerative work, and lowering the input. So the beauty is that's possible with the small grains. But I would argue that the small grains can grow in places that corn cannot.
So yeah, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the most interesting things to think about with barley is that it's a grain with Mediterranean origins. I guess we'd say, a fertile crescent, so to speak, and this kind of the dry summer. And one of the things that I'm sure you'll appreciate is people say, well, you're from the greater Seattle area. It's like, well, does it rain all the time? And like, yeah, it does for like 10 months. And then, but like in the summer, there's a really nice dry period where you don't get a lot of rain as opposed to like the Midwest where you get those really big storms. Barley really, because it has this Mediterranean origin, I guess I'd say, where it likes a dry period during ripening. The Pacific Northwest is actually, especially the western part of the Pacific Northwest, is well suited for this like cool, wet most of the year, but it's dry at just the perfect time for barley to do its thing as it reaches this ripening process, which is quite interesting. And that's one of the reasons when I say like barley works really well in this environment, because actually the greater Seattle area is funny enough classified as a quasi like cold but Mediterranean style climate. A lot of people don't know that. Because we have this kind of, cool, wet, but not hyper cold winter and this kind of, dry summer that isn't full of, like a lot of the weather you'd see on the East Coast. It's quite interesting that way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think part of that is I think people forget how sort of further south the U.S. is than
for sure.
Europe as well. Like I'm way up here, like I'm in Berlin and I'm on the same latitude as Juneau,
Yeah.
It's just a different thing. Sort of carrying on that look at regionality in this sort of thing. And maybe Dr. Jones, you can lead this off, but what do you see in the difference, like, for instance, if you look at, throw us off the top of my head, like Buffalo Trace, they say they'll use North Dakota red winter wheat. Whereas, Matt, maybe you're using your wheat from another specific region or source. Is that just simply a commodity, like they're getting cheaper red winter wheat from North Dakota? Or is there going to be a physiological difference in that wheat from that state? Not
really. So with the commodity market, and I should say that we're out of the commodity market 100%. So we don't bother with that, right? But it's designed to make everything the same, and Matt kind of alluded to that up front. So regionality is a good marketing kick, right? But there's also reality to it too. So we know that here in Western Washington, being cool and wet, things happen differently, right? And again, I don't want to go all terroir, but we things can taste different based on the fungi and bacteria and things that live on them and everything else. So we know all that, but yeah, the regionality is important for us in terms of who can benefit from it, right? And we really like saying that we like to keep the value where it's produced, right? So 3-minute walk from where I am right now is the largest craft malting facility in the United States, right? Wow. Skagit Valley Malting. Yeah. And what they've offered the growers here is someplace to sell their barley that's not just dumping it in a big commodity bucket, right? So that's how we look at regionality is keeping value where it's produced keeping nuance and novelty and flavors and things like that. And I do want to at some point talk about the colored barleys that we're working on with Westland. They're funding a student that's working on that. So, you know, now or later, whatever.
No, I was just going to ask about that, is like the selection process of the unique barleys that you use, but also I'd like to touch on that first and also talk a little bit about organic and regenerative and why that's important. But yeah, let's go straight into that. Like walk us through this process.
So that's commodity barley. That's what Matt said. Basically, everyone's using is that.
And people have probably seen that on every distillery tour.
They haven't seen this. That's barley.
I would say that's what Steve is showing there is not roasted. So people may have seen a dark roasted barley.
Yeah, this is raw. That's raw.
Oh, wow.
Sorry about that, but that's raw barley.
Wow, okay.
That's raw barley. That's variation. And we look at that, again, here's a commodity barley that you've seen on every tour. So
like white rice and wild rice.
Exactly. And what that lacks is variation. And if we're looking at, you know, and I just read a report a few months ago that Scotland said, oh, we're not going to have barley for malt in a couple of years because of climate change. They're leaving the breeders out of that equation, right? And if we breed for diversity in our fields, that's a climate-friendly approach, right? So if our climate is chaotic, we can make our fields chaotic genetically, right? And that brings us forward, and we don't need to get into the complexities of it. But what we also find there is flavor and novelty and nuance, and that's a really important point for us. Is if once we're out of the commodity system, we can breed for whatever in the hell we want, right? And we talk to the maltsters directly, we talk to the distillers, and we breed barleys that they want, and what they want is something different. And there's a beauty in being different. It's not always easy. It's not it can not always be productive, but there's a tremendous beauty to it and tremendous payoffs too. So that's how our breeding strategies work.
I'd love to expand.
How does that then translate to your end?
Well, I think before we get there, I think one of the interesting things, if I can break down the world of grain essentially into, there's kind of three stages, the way that I look at it, three kind of moments in time where distilleries could be. Nobody's in the third one yet, but this is where we're headed. I'll get to that in a second. But the way that everybody sources grain right now, Steve is saying a commodity. So if you're watching, if you don't know what a commodity is in terms of grain form, you know, it's a grain that is developed, you know, so that it can be grown basically everywhere across America. You know, it'll grow fine. It'll grow okay across most of America. It'll be developed to be sprayed, which is a thing we'll touch on later. But it'll develop to be in conventional agriculture and conventional chemical agriculture. But the whole idea is that this variety will grow in Wisconsin and North Dakota and Montana and Washington State. And then through the malting process and, you know, grain elevators, it's all mixed together. So everybody gets the same thing all across America. This is the same thing that happens in Scotland. It's the same thing that happens in continental Europe. It is the Western world's approach to grain. So when we make whiskey, us as an industry, that is what people are sourcing. And again, you can make great whiskey out of that, but you're not really doing it in a way that is evocative of that grain, because the whole point is that everybody's getting exactly the same thing. Now that's stage one, okay? Mm-hmm. Stage two is pursuing these different barley varietals. So like Dr. Jones was showing there, you've got black barley varieties, purple barley varieties. I mean, you mentioned in the introduction, right? So you mentioned in corn, there's blue corn, there's white corn, there's red corn. You know, this idea is in our industry very, very new. And in terms of percentages of the whole of whiskey making globally is microscopic. You know, it's you know, nothing, you know. So, but this is really where we are headed. We at Westland, we've used 22 different varieties of barley, which is, I believe, more than all of the Scottish whiskey industry put together. But we're able to do that, to Dr. Jones's point, because we have this system in place, this agricultural system that, you know, we have the BreadLab and the team there. We've got farmers who are willing to push the boundaries and try new things. We've got maltsters who are willing to go off the commodity system to try new varieties. And we can get into this where we're using these different varieties that are chosen for flavor, that are chosen because they work. I mean, we've used a variety that only works really well in the Skagit Valley. It was rejected east of the Cascades, which is a very different climate, to be fair, but only worked really well in the Skagit Valley. It's the only place that it grows, and we're able to do that. And that's totally against the entire premise of a commodity, right? Which is kind of lowest common denominator. So that's kind of where we are today. As you know, at Westland, we've been distilling grain this way from 2014. Started working with the BreadLab 10 years ago, or at least met the BreadLab 10 years ago, and started distilling grain from Skagit Valley malting in 2014. But the really exciting thing is where we're going. And where we're going, this kind of stage 3 is like, this is going to sound insane, but like we're headed towards the barley singularity almost. Like, okay, just so hang with me for a second here, right? So what Dr. Jones is talking about, this is really, really important. He's talking about the genetic diversity in the fields. So when we talk about a variety, what do we mean? Okay, so a variety in the conventional kind of grain system is they're taking a variety, or they're crossing something, and they cross it over and over and over and over again for 10, 15 years until when you take that seed and you plant it, everything out in that field is completely genetically homogeneous, so that everything is exactly the same. That's absolutely the goal of the commodity industry, consistency and all the rest of that stuff. Now that comes with challenges, especially with regards to disease resistance. I'll get to that in a second. But what we're looking at now is not just these different varieties, but what happens if you don't breed that variety all the way through to complete genetic purity? What is the idea of a variety? What should we be breaking down the idea of what a variety is? Because when you cross things, Steve, maybe you could hold up that one that has all that mixed material in there. So what this could be, I actually don't know, but what this could be, if you cross, let's say, a purple variety and a blonde variety, right? So two different color barleys, if you cross them against each other, what you plant out in the field will be, what you see is a mixture of, some will be purple, some will be blonde. You'll have a huge genetic diversity in the same way that, you can have the same parents, right? But as kids, your brothers and sisters can be really different, right?
Right.
So when we look at that, we go, okay, if you could try to achieve complete genetic homogeneity way off in the future, but if we didn't, if you kind of went about halfway through that process and stopped, and you said that was a variety, or maybe a new understanding of variety, what you have is genetic variation in the field. Okay, so why is this interesting? If we take this new understanding of a variety, we plant it, right? We plant it out in the field. And maybe, Zach, I'm sure, even being in Berlin, I'm sure you heard about the heat dome, right? That impacted the Pacific Northwest over this past year. People who were watching, who aren't familiar, it got hot this summer.
I was there.
Oh, you were? Okay, yeah. It was,
Yeah.
I mean, it was, we do not deal with heat well in the Pacific Northwest. So, but this is the thing, is that some grains, some crops failed because it was completely genetically homogeneous. And if one grain fails, it all fails in the field. But if you have a variety that is no longer pure, but is in fact genetically diverse, it is kind of like, it's like evolution in the field. It's a population almost. It's a living, breathing thing. So you sow this out in the field, and what grows is adapting to what happens, not just in the terroir of the field, but also to the climate. So all of a sudden you have a variety that is more evocative of place, of terroir, because it adapts, because the genetic variation will adapt to that terroir, but it'll also adapt to vintage characteristics. Like in a heat dome, some will survive, some will fall off. And all of a sudden this variety, as you harvest it, takes a really different shape. And then when you malt it, and I promise this is important, but when you malt it, you take this, and normally if you were to tell a maltster, like, here is all of this barley and it looks really different. Some of it was really mature when we harvested, some of it was really immature. They would go, this is crazy. Like, you're supposed to bring us completely uniform barley. But if we didn't do that, and this is where we're going, we're doing this now with Dr. Jones, with the BreadLab, and with Skagit Valley Malting and some other malting partners, is like, if you bring this stuff in that is more variable from the field, when you malt it, actually you get more complexity out of the malt, which actually means you have more flavor complexity out of the whole thing. So where we're going with this, and this kind of, I guess to kind of reiterate this like 3 stages thing, which is the way that I conceptualize it in my head, is like we've gone from commodities and now we're kind of in this sweet spot right now of zone 2, stage 2, different varieties that are chosen for flavor. And that's great. And it's really, really exciting. We've been working on this for the better part of the last decade. There's other people in this country doing this with rye, other people doing it with, corn, different types of corn. But where we're going is the space where we're breaking down the idea of what a variety even should be, and by extension, what malted barley is, which is like, I know this kind of sounds crazy, but like where we're going is going to fundamentally, I think personally, change what it means to source malted barley, and therefore how we make single malt whiskey. And we're headed that direction. To be very clear, we're going completely off the commodity system. Like, I'm totally in love with the direction this is going, and that's where Westland is going to source from that type of environment 100% by 2025.
Oh, wow, that's phenomenal. Just a very, oh, go ahead.
I want to interject, Matt. I've been saying genetical stuff for a long time, and I've never heard it explained as well as you just did.
Yeah,
Really,
I get it, man.
All the shit I say. So yeah, it's great.
This is I keep like ranting to my wife, and she keeps saying, "Matt, stop talking to me about barley." Just like, so I have a lot of practice.
That's great. Yeah.
I wanted to go on a quick little tangent here, just very quickly. But when you're looking at these grains, especially like that perfect barley, I mean, I'm sorry, I keep going back to corn here, but I know the difference in the flavor notes I get from a blue corn compared to a white or a yellow or a red corn. Like, you can physically feel it from the grain to the final product with whatever you're making. What flavor notes are coming through on these barleys that you're showing up here that then actually come through in the whiskey? Because I think, if you're watching this, you probably know that yeast will impart a flavor, will be full, fruity, spicy. The barrel's going to impart a flavor through vanilla and so on and so forth. What's coming through in those barleys to the final product?
So the way that I like to describe it, and we have used, so as I said, we've used 22 different barley varieties. 4 of them have been colored varieties, either purple or black. The rest have been tan or blonde, pale varieties. So when we look at especially those dark colored varieties, which is what excites us so much, and this is where the research that we're kind of funding and working on with the BreadLab is like really focused on the colored stuff, is, I guess I describe it as like the pale tan varieties are like different schools of thought on like a Pilsner, if that kind of makes sense.
Sure, yeah.
If you were to follow the same recipe, you would have differences like, oh, these are clearly different variations on a Pilsner or a Pale Ale or things like that. Whereas like the purple variety, when the first time I tasted it with Skagit Valley Malting, was making something called a smash beer, which is a single malt, so one type of malted barley and a single hop beer. And I tasted it, this purple barley variety. I was like, this tastes like plum wine that I would get at like a sushi restaurant. I was like, okay, this is the wildest thing. We turned that, and when we distilled it, the flavor notes was like candied, like candied, stone fruit, like candied plum, but also like a very amazing tomato soup. And it was like baffling. Like, I was just like, this is totally unlike anything that we have tasted before in this, color. So this is where I think when we especially like, you look at it, you say, okay, there's a difference here in color. Is that linked to flavor? And actually, the interesting thing is a lot of the color is from a group of compounds called anthocyanins. Anthocyanins are in wine proven to be linked to variety flavor in wine grape skins. So that's what makes the wine grape skins different, which leads to variety flavor. So that same type of compound, those anthocyanins, that's what's giving most of these barleys their color. Now, this hasn't been studied in barley the same way it's been studied in wine grapes, but our hypothesis is kind of roughly the same, that the color is linked with the flavor somehow in a way that is not yet defined or proven, I guess we'd say. But we've distilled it, and we know that there's something there that is really distinct. Now, when it comes to the kind of arc of that flavor in whiskey, that's tricky. And honestly, I don't know the answer to that yet, because how that thing, how that interacts with barrels, is its own thing, where those flavors come from, how they evolve. it's not totally understood. What I can tell you is that the experiments we've done with, experiments, we're making the whiskey out of, these dark colored varieties, is proving to be distinct and very interesting as it ages and as it matures. So it continues on down that road. But that's, the goal, I think, for Westland by 2025, if we can source about 40% colored varieties by 2025, that's the goal, out of varieties that are being bred by Dr. Jones and the PhD student at the BreadLab.
Really quickly, let's talk a little bit more about the growth process of the grain, because we touched briefly on organic and regenerative. And sort of as a lay person, I understand organic being, grown without the use of petrochemicals and, Roundup and shit like that. Whereas I understand regenerative as grown in through an indigenous background, like the Three Sisters, where you're putting nutrients back into the ground as you're growing and taking nutrients out, and there's a cycle that allows you to grow more efficiently. Can you sort of walk us through how that translates then to barley growth and what you're seeing?
I can give a little bit. The key on regenerative, and we don't need to get wrapped up in the word, right? Because the word is a little over-popularized right now. But it's basically, are we building the soils or are we depleting them?
Right.
Pretty simple. By building the soils, what are we doing? We're doing cover crops. We're adding organic matter. We're leaving more organic matter there. We're not destroying the soil by spraying a lot of things that are killing everything in it and on it and around it, right? So that's basically the approach. And then organic would be even lowering off-farm inputs even to a greater degree, right? So no synthetic this or that. Okay, so these are things that we do. So in our breeding program, we are 100% organic. Everything we do is organic. We work with growers that may not be organic, they may be regenerative, they may be whatever, right? But we work with the whole rainbow of growers. But the key is for something like barley is, does it grow better? Is it more healthy in a more healthy soil? Yes, right? And part of regenerative too is animal integration, getting animals back on the farm where they belong instead of in a concrete blimp hanger, So how do we build the soil? And a really key point, Zach, and it gets pushed aside, is we're not talking about lower yields, right? And it's so critically important to us as breeders that if we're talking about flavor, whether it's in a distilled spirit or in the food or any nutritional value, anything of that, we never give up yield. So we're not into ancient heirloom and heritage things that are going to yield 1/10 of what we could yield.
Right.
For our health and the health of the planet and the health of the soils, we need to get as much as we can per acre in a responsible manner. So we don't work with really low yielding things. My job as a plant breeder is to increase yield. My job as a plant breeder who believes in helping the climate and the planet is to do that with as few inputs as possible and to get as much yield as possible and to do it in a way that's economical for in this case, the maltster, the brewer, the distiller, and the person that it goes to, right? Bread's a little easier, right? Because bread should be affordable for everybody. Whiskey, I don't deal with cheap whiskey, right? So
right.
So how do you
into that?
Yeah. So that's the key. It can be narrowed down very simply. We're building the soil or we're depleting it. We've got to build it. Okay. Are we spraying the shit out of it? No. Okay. Can we still get high yields? Yes. That's the very simple bubble we work in, or umbrella we work under.
Sort of as tangentially, right now we're seeing a lot of synthetic products, obviously Beyond Meat, Impossible Burgers, things like that with synthetic meat, but you're also seeing it's a hexaploid wheat, which is a synthetic wheat. Do you feel like there is a future in that when it comes to, what's happening now, or is it just sort of, where do you land on that?
Well, yeah, I land off to the side on that one. So if you look at big food, we call big ag, big food, big industry. Go to wheat because it's easier. They would love to produce a wheat kernel that had no bran or germ. It was 100% white flour. It'd be just like this baggie full of white powder. Okay, that was the seed. You just open the bag and there's your white flour. Okay, that's they would they'd just stop breathing if that happened. They'd be so happy, right? So, or maybe they'd breathe more. So, but that's one extreme. We're not into that, right? We're not into all the fake stuff. And the beauty is you don't need it, right? And if you look at barley, it's one of the most beautiful plants. It's one of the most efficient plants. And if you look at that seed, it's packaged. Matt mentioned amino acids and oils and fats and starches and all this stuff. It figured it out. Okay, the barley figured it out before we did, right? We just went in and sort of captured stuff. To think we can change it in some dramatic way, like you hear people saying, well, we're going to fix photosynthesis, right? We're going to make photosynthesis more efficient. Are you shitting me, right? You're really going to make photosynthesis more efficient? It's been around for several million years, right? It's pretty good at what it does, right? So we're not into all the fake stuff, right? And I'm sure there are people that would love to go there, right? With barley too, it's enzymes and starch, right? So it's fermentable sugars. Yeah, you could make that in one of these things behind me, well, that one's a hot dog machine, so you wouldn't do it in that.
But if you did, it'd be a cool story, I would say.
It'd be super cool. if it tastes like a hot dog, yeah.
If it tastes like a hot dog. I think the point here is like there's a lot of people who are trying to make a more perfect commodity, and that's just not our approach collectively at all. Yeah. Our approach is to do something that is holistically sustainable, and that is, that's got to be economically viable for the farmer. In those scenarios where people are trying to engineer something, better, can the farmer continue to earn a living wage growing that crop? Right. Can they do it without subsidies? Which, of course, with corn they can't, because corn is super heavily subsidized, and probably not enough people know that in this country, but something like 50% of the farm gate value in this country is subsidized in one way or another by our collective tax dollars. So we're trying to. It's a different model, and commodities have a place, and I think we're just trying to develop something parallel to that, which is you can develop barley varieties. I actually want to pick up a little bit on the previous organic thread here a little bit, which was like the barley variety. So when people say, "Oh, I got to take something out and plant it," oh, it's going to yield less because it's organic, or it's going to lose out to the weeds. But that's because since World War II, everything that we have bred and developed has been developed to be sprayed with that, with chemicals.
Yeah, the Green Revolution and all that, yeah.
Exactly. So when you take that and you plant it, so they developed, in barley's particular case, this nice short little barley variety. So it doesn't fall over a ton. It doesn't lodge, what we call it. It doesn't lodge, doesn't fall over. When you plant that and you plant it in an organic system where there can be weeds, well, the weeds can grow taller than you go, oh, shoot, there's a bunch of weeds here getting in the way. But that's because the barley that you chose to plant in that organic system was never designed to be grown organically. So that's why what the BreadLab is doing is so important, not just with our barley stuff, but with all the grains they're growing are under organic conditions. So they thrive there. They thrive under organic conditions when you plant it. Actually, yeah, it does. It works really, really well. The thing is, you don't need those chemicals if you just breed the types of barley that don't need them. That's the dirty little secret that much of the agricultural industry doesn't want. And that's the really powerful thing when it comes to where we're headed here, with the agriculture. It's not just the flavor, but the flavor, and as Dr. Jones said, you can have yield, you can have it all. Like people, including me, admittedly, like when we started this process, I thought the idea of flavor and yield and sustainability were mutually exclusive ideas, but they're not actually. Right. They're really not. That's a really important thing.
So it's a matter of, management balance and, bringing everything together.
Well, it's a big part of that is about decentralization. So This is where, like, if you take a commodity, the yields of commodity barleys I would say on average across the U.S. is lower than the yield of barley, or not heirloom, but these new barley varieties that we're developing in Skagit are much higher because barley thrives in Western Washington climates.
Right.
So we
Right.
have higher yields in the field, even with these new varieties. And the thing is, you're planting stuff in a place that doesn't like it to be planted. So stop trying to force something to be in a place that it doesn't want to be. This is why it's compelling to make single malt whiskey in a place where barley thrives, is because you can have all these things where the system can benefit holistically together, the people, the environment, and the flavor. You can make great whiskey out of it all at the same time.
That's fantastic. So, gentlemen, I first of all really want to thank you for this wonderful conversation. I feel like I've expanded my knowledge in a wonderful way, and I hope our audience has as well. But before we wrap everything up, how can we support this? Like, how can we support the BreadLab? How can we support Westland in this process of using these more sustainable grains, these more interesting varietals? Like, what's the process for people out there to follow along and also engage?
I think for the BreadLab, we need support. Everything we do is based on outside support. So Westland is funding one of our PhD students. I think if you're interested in the BreadLab, go to our website, just look up WSU BreadLab. We communicate a lot through Instagram. We have beautiful pictures of barley and what we're doing on there too. So that would be a start, is just go to those two and read up on it. And I think in general too, just think of ways that can be different, right? If you're a distiller or brewer or maltster or farmer or whatever, just think of that it's okay to be different, right? And to get out of these locked in systems, right? And again, we're not, and Matt just said it, we're not saying all this comes at an expense of yield or anything like that, right? It has to work for all of us to make sense. And that's what we're interested in, right?
Yeah, I love that message. That's fantastic. And Matt, what about on your end? How can people support you?
Well, I think before we go to Westland, the Westland thing is just, if you could please buy some Westland whiskey and drink it, that would make me very happy. If people are interested, especially in the new varieties and everything, where we're going with this, the tip of the spear, I guess, from the Westland point of view, is our Colere program. So it's a series of bottlings made with varieties that aren't in the commodity system. We're just, edition 2 will come out in May. But we did edition 1 last May with a variety that nobody's used before to make single malt whiskey. So it's easy. I mean, that part's easy enough from the Westland point of view. If you like what you're hearing, just drink Westland whiskey. That helps. But to come back to the BreadLab actually for a second, what most people don't understand is that we have our priorities completely backwards in America when it comes to agriculture and the funding that supports it. Steve Jones is part of a land grant university, and land grant universities are supposed to be breeding for the public good, and which is an amazing thing. But when you go off piste like this, what we're talking about here is off the commodity system. This represents a radical departure from agriculture as it is known and understood and practiced in America today, except for a very few, count them on one hand, spots around the U.S. Skagit Valley is one of those places, and a couple places in the South, upstate New York, and things like that. And so financial funding of the BreadLab so that they can do these things, because when you want to go non-chemical, the chemical companies aren't going to fund you. So it's things like that. If you're interested in things like that, interested in flavor, the companies that profit from having non-flavorful products aren't going to fund you. It's things like that I think most people don't understand. So if anybody is able to contribute directly to the BreadLab, I think that would be an amazing thing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Dr. Jones, is it like breadlab.com or
it just went up in the chat column there. So yeah, it's breadlab.wsu.edu. So or just do a search, it'll pop up no matter what. So.
And of course, Westland Distillery you can find on Instagram and westlanddistillery.com and all your socials and so forth. Again, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm very, very excited about the future of barley and what you guys are doing. And I'm excited to support BreadLab, and I'm excited to drink your whiskey in May, Matt. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's attended today. I hope it's been a bit of an education for everyone. Just a last little bit, don't forget to check out beverage.co for more panels for the American Single Malt Tasting Kits, which is fantastically wonderful view of single malts in the United States. You can also find future panel discussions. I'm going to be hosting one about barrels next week, February 2nd, same time, same place. We're going to have a fun chat there talking about what the barrel does to the whiskey with Virginia Distillery lead blender Amanda Beckwith and William Hornaday from Kelvin Cooperage. And until then, that's, I think, an episode, guys. That's a panel. I really appreciate it, and I hope we get to meet again and talk some more.
Cool. Thanks
Thanks
so
very much, Zach.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.